Hello and welcome. I'm Karthik Shankaran, Senior Research Fellow Geoeconomics in the Global South Program of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. The Quincy Institute is a transpartisan think tank based in Washington, D.C., and advocates a foreign policy that emphasizes military restraint and diplomatic engagement and cooperation with other nations. We believe that these will serve American interests and values better than policies that prioritize the maintenance of U.S. global dominance through force. Now, in the Global South program, we study and write about a vast arc of countries going from the Philippines through Southeast Asia, South Asia, Africa, and Latin America, Manila to Mexico City, as it were. These are countries that are not great powers and are not primary allies of a great power in geopolitical terms. And in economic terms, countries whose primary focus right now is development. I have a background in finance, so I spent about a few decades thinking of these as emerging markets. So I might slip into that terminology occasionally, but this is the arena that the Global South program is largely concerned with. I look at within the Global South program, I look primarily at the interactions of geopolitics with economic, trade, and financial tools in the context of Quincy's larger mission of restraint. So it's been a pretty busy year, as you can imagine. I'm delighted to have here today Francisco Rodriguez, whose latest book, The Collapse of Venezuela, is a very comprehensive read, not just on what's happening in Venezuela, but it also raises a host of other questions of interest to our program. What's been happening in Venezuela, obviously, including most recent headlines that we'll be talking about. But there are also lessons here about broader development strategies across the Global South, the weaponization of trade, finance, and sanctions, and the interactions between domestic politics in the U.S. foreign policy, and the domestic politics of foreign countries. I'm sure you can all think about headlines or news stories you've read that cover all of these. These are all issues. I mean, these are things that have been prominent for a while, but have really come to the fore in recent months. And it's a privilege to have Francisco here today because he can talk about all this and more. He just The Collapse of Venezuela is an amazing book, and it's a great point of entry into all these issues. He's the Rice Family Professor of the Practice of International Public Affairs at the University of Denver's Joseph Corbell School of Global and Public Affairs. A native of Venezuela, he's also the founder of Oil for Venezuela, a nonprofit organization focused on finding solutions to Venezuela's humanitarian crisis. He received a PhD in economics from Harvard University and an undergraduate degree in economics from Venezuela's Universidad Católica Andrés Bello. He has held prominent positions in the public and private sector and international organizations, including being head of the Economic and Financial Advisor of the Venezuelan National Assembly, head of the research team of the United Nations Human Development Report Office, and chief Andean economist at Bank of America. He is the author of 4 books and more than 60 research articles. His research has appeared in the American Economic Journal, Journal of Economic Growth, Journal of Macroeconomics, Journal of Politics and World Development, among many other peer-reviewed journals. So it's a pleasure to have you here, Francisco. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, it's my pleasure being here, Kartik. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Now, as I said, this is a very rich book that raises lots and lots of questions. But I'd like to start out with the most recent news, just get your views on it. We've seen lots of headlines. We've seen that the U.S. administration has put a bounty of $50 million on President Maduro. You may or may not wish to push quotation marks around president. I'll leave viewers with that option. And some recent gunboat adding to that, some recent gunboat diplomacy, in fact. So what do you think is happening right now, and where do you see it going? So let's start there, and then we can go into the deeper roots of this, where your book is absolutely fascinating. But let's just start with what's current.
Okay, well, it's always very dangerous regarding Venezuela to try to predict where it's going. I mean, actually, as an economist, I tend to follow John Kenneth Galbraith's dictum, which is if you're going to make a prediction, You can predict dates or you can predict magnitudes, but don't predict both at the same time. So you always have a way to back out. So you can predict that the US is going to invade Venezuela, but just don't put a date on it. Now, the US is doing a lot of things which seem contradictory with respect to Venezuela. First of all, it has mobilized warships, it has raised the bounty on Maduro to $50 million, which means that it's the highest that it's ever put on anybody, in fact. But at the same time, it actually has granted a license to Chevron to export Venezuelan oil. So, trying to make sense of those contradictions is somewhat difficult. And something that I understood some time ago, looking at Venezuela and looking at other countries like Venezuela, where you do tend to see very similar patterns of apparently contradictory policies, is that they actually arise out of a mode of governance. And that mode of governance is that of personalistic leaders who, in concentrating power in their own hands, what they do is that they set up teams with competing visions, which both are in charge of different overlapping spheres of authority. So in many governments, you have kind of different groups, right? I mean, you can have like the Orthodox and Reformers. But this is a bit different. This is when you actually take an area such as Venezuela policy, and you actually put people who have different visions and you give them both authority, which is
Hmm.
what we've seen happening with Rick Grenell, who goes and meets with Maduro and negotiates the release of American prisoners and negotiates deportation flights. And then you have Marco Rubio pushing this kind of maximum pressure, return to maximum pressure, sanctions, and at least talking about or being explicit about the possibility of military action, even if not going there. Now, this is if you step back from the complete focus on Venezuela for a minute and you start asking yourself, well, how common is this pattern? You actually see it in a lot of the Trump administration's policies. I mean, you see it in kind of Navarro and Lutnick v. Besant in terms of trade policy. For example, you see it in the fight between Musk and Doge and the Republican lawmakers with respect to fiscal discipline and the Big Beautiful Bill. But it's also something that was very similar to what I became used over years of seeing in Venezuelan policymaking, or to what Kremlin watchers watch for example, in the way in which Putin manages policy. And it ultimately has to do with reinforcing authority at the center, with the fact that when you have these competing groups that are deciding over policy, then ultimately the chief executive is the arbiter of their differences.
Hmm.
That makes policy particularly difficult to predict because it's not the professionalized bureaucratic approach to policy making where you have a government, the government has a platform, it has some ideas, it designates a group of people to carry out those ideas. You have competing ideas being carried out. Now, all of that said, I mean, I do think that we can look at scenarios. I don't think that we are even remotely close to a military action to topple the Maduro regime. Among other things, the amount of troops that have been mobilized are tiny relative to what you would need in order to take Venezuela through an amphibious assault, because the U.S. does not have access to land entry either through Colombia or through Brazil. And Guyana is nearly kind of impossible. There's actually no infrastructure in that border. So effectively, I mean, the people who are thinking that the U.S. might invade Venezuela, it's just you can't do it. I mean, the U.S. Having a military base in Panama and having what was essentially a police force in Panama that commanded by Noriega, it
Hmm.
still had a 2-to-1 advantage. So if you wanted to
Hmm.
do that against the Venezuelan military, you would need to have between 200,000 to 300,000 troops. So, and there's just absolutely no appetite in the Trump administration, in American public opinion, to have a mobilization of troops similar to what you had, say, kind of in Desert Storm. So that's not it. but I wouldn't completely rule out any type of military action. And it's actually quite interesting if you look at Mark Esper's memoirs of the first Trump administration. He does reveal that in cabinet discussions, the hawks, which kind of included persons like Mauricio Claver Carone, who is not in the
Hmm.
administration but is very close to the line of Rubio, they were actually pushing for military attacks on Venezuelan oil facilities, and particularly on the port of Jose in northeastern Venezuela. I don't think that the U.S. would target oil infrastructure because that would go completely
Yeah.
against the current purpose of getting Chevron to get that oil out. But I wouldn't rule out some type of kind of military show of force maybe aimed at Venezuelan military installations. But it might be that, or it might not. It may be that, and it may even be that some groups within the Trump administration are pushing for that type of show of force because they have a belief, and this is a belief that the radical opposition also has, that somehow if you put enough pressure on Maduro and you scare him enough and you scare the military enough, that will lead to the collapse of the regime. I think that that's really kind of unrealistic, and we've been through that
Yeah.
story several times before. But I do think it's a dominant mode of thinking. So it's really, in the end, the question is whether Trump is going to let that faction go far enough, or whether he's going to say, no, now it's time for a bit of the other medicine, and then go and call back Grinnell and have him engage in negotiations again.
Thanks very much. And that's helpful. I mean, so, and it also makes sense that um, if there is something, it might be a performative show of force rather than anything, and then just see what happens. The other point I was going to make is that certainly, you know, in terms of looking at trade policy itself, I myself have come to the conclusion that, and this is not just in this administration, I would argue it goes back at least 10 years. There are multiple factions in America on trade. I call them, you know, how people want to use trade. The people who want to decouple, the people who want to use trade to, uh, you know, tariffs or other actions to open other markets. There are others who want to nearshore. There are others who want to reshore. There are others who want to completely decouple from China. There are others who want to derail from China. There are people who just want revenues, which is, so I think that may actually be physiological in some sense, factional politics around these issues, but then potentially it becomes when you have a concentration of executive authority and also control over, all three, over at least two branches of government, possibly three, you create these additional issues of the conduit through which these multiple factions are reconciled and the predictability of that conduit, which is something that we're that we may be grappling with. I mean, you set the stage really well for the next, kind of to go deeper in here, and that's what your book is so amazing at. Now, one of the things I did want to mention was that we talk about we talk about Venezuela in the news periodically, but something that I had, and this is probably my ignorance, I had not appreciated to um, the degree. I'm used to benchmarking deep GDP falls in terms of the Great Depression, Argentina after after the between 1999 and 2002, 2003, and Greece. And that's kind of 25 to 30%. The Great Depression was even bigger, more than 40% in nominal terms. But Venezuela is a staggering figure. You have more than 70% uh, peak to trough GDP fall, and also 25% of the population emigrating. Both are astonishing numbers. The latter is particularly astonishing because it's not a wartime situation. You think about Afghanistan, you think about Syria, but these are extraordinary. And I just wanted to put that out there because when you say the collapse of Venezuela, that collapse is encapsulated in those two numbers, I think. But in your book, you point to the there are long roots to this, right? There is a concentrated collapse, there is a longer term story, and your book operates on multiple levels and very many different levels. You know, there are these intersecting themes and chronologies that go back, in some instances, to the beginning of um, of the century and the origins of Chavismo. So you have developments in Venezuelan politics and institutions since the late 1990s. There's the story of the global oil price, which is very important for Venezuela. And then there's a particular set of relationships between the U.S. and Venezuela, the Venezuelan government and the Venezuelan opposition. And I'm reminded here of Henry Hyde saying in 2002 that Chavez, Lula, and Castro were the equivalent of an axis of evil in the Americas. So there's kind of a long-standing, um, but antagonism, conflict, set of views that are embedded in there. So as you look at all these three different facets, the economics, Venezuelan politics, and U.S. Venezuelan politics, could you just give us a kind of a quick chronology of how we got to the 70% collapse? And
Okay. Well, it's actually quite striking because the that 70% collapse actually comes after another very poor episode in economic growth, which many economists called a collapse at the time, and myself included, in the last quarter of the 20th century. This is something actually quite remarkable, and I have a recent article with Venezuelan political scientist Michael Penfold in which we look at this fact and we look at the political explanations for it. For why is it that you had the same country being among the worst performers in the world, both in the last quarter of the 20th century and the first quarter of the 21st century, despite very different political institutions. A lot of the explanation that essentially centers on Chavez kind of misses this fact that this is an economy that was doing very poorly even when Chavez came into power. And in fact, back in 2012, Ricardo Hausman and I published a book called Venezuela Before Chavez, Anatomy of an Economic Collapse. And we were thinking that was the collapse. We didn't know that you were going to have another collapse like this one coming. Now, all of that said, the real collapse of Venezuela, much larger in dimension to what happened at the end of the 20th century, is what has happened during the presidency of Nicolas Maduro. In real terms, it is a collapse that is equivalent to three consecutive Great Depressions. It is and sometimes I have a hard time wrapping my head around this, but it is the largest documented economic contraction in world history, by which I mean the largest in the nearly 200 countries for which the Penn World Table have estimated data since 1950, but also the largest when you compare it with any country in the Madison Project database, which goes back to year zero. So what that effectively means is that the level of economic destruction during peacetime in Venezuela. Now, there have been some larger wartime collapses. Those are, Democratic Republic of Congo, Liberia, Iraq, and Kuwait. Okay, it's you can understand how an economy collapses when you actually have kind of armies bombarding its factories. But how does this happen in peacetime? And that's where I came to see this as a puzzle. And now I'm a growth economist, a development economist by training, and this type of outliers, I believe, are there's two types of approaches that economists take to outliers. There are some that drop them from their data set and say, okay, that's not what I want to explain. And there are others, and that's more me, who say, wow, that's really something interesting. Man, if we have something that is so anomalous, it must be telling us something about some of the underlying processes. Now, what happened in Venezuela, and it's very hard to decide when to start. When you try to craft that historical lens. And in fact, one of the arguments that Penfold and I make in that new article is that the Venezuelan mode of governance that you have right now under Chavismo is actually very similar to that which developed at the beginning of the 20th century, end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, in a period that was known as the Andean hegemony. And it's because a closely knit military faction from the Andes region ended up controlling Venezuelan politics for nearly 60 years. And it's quite a, it's the similarities between those two groups are quite remarkable. And it illustrates what happens with the vulnerabilities of the Venezuelan state, which tend to fall into a situation where you basically have essentially two solutions. One of them, which is what you developed during the Venezuelan democratic period with something that was called the Punto Fijo Accord, is one in which you have many veto players. So it's a system in which you have institutional stability, you have some degree of power sharing, but it's a system that reacts very poorly to negative economic shocks because you can't, when you have multiple veto players, you can't adjust. That generated the economic and political gridlock with which Venezuelans became fed up with in the 1990s, and it fed into that first economic collapse, which is how Hugo Chavez gets elected in 1998. And when he assumes power, what Chavez says is, well, first of all, this is what's happening is the exclusive responsibility of the old party elites. We have to get rid of them. And in order to do that, we need a new constitution. That new constitution has to give the presidency the authority to carry out these reforms, to really throw the bums out. And effectively, he is able to reform the constitution, to write a new constitution. And what that constitution does is that it creates a system that is quite singular among electoral systems because it is a system with absolutely no separation of powers. I mean, there's a formal separation of powers, but all branches of government are ultimately subordinate to the presidency. The Venezuelan president can convene elections for a constituent assembly that can dissolve all other branches of government. I mean, imagine, for example, US politics if Donald Trump, right after being elected, could have said, I'm going to call a referendum, and that's going to allow me to name a new Supreme Court. That's going to allow me to dissolve Congress. That's going to allow me to take control of any other institutions that are counterweights to my power. So what Chavez was able to do essentially was transform Venezuela into something that is an electoral regime, but it's not a democracy in the liberal sense because liberal democracies are characterized, the liberal definition of democracy is characterized by there being counterweights on executive power and restraint on executive power. That's not what you had in Venezuela. You had something that's much more like an electoral autocracy where you had elections, but whoever won those elections captured absolute power. So what this did is that it raised the stakes of the political conflict. And now there was a period of time, which was a period of relative tranquility and of certain Venezuelan progress between 1999 and 2012, where there was a huge oil boom.
Yeah.
That oil boom led to oil prices to increase from $9 a barrel, which is what Venezuelan oil was selling at the end of 1998 when Chavez was elected, to more than $100 a barrel. So that meant that that the government could continue to be popular. It could spend out of that money. It could win elections. So you didn't really have, I mean, these rules on that had so raised the stakes of political conflict were really not binding because the opposition couldn't win elections because the government was popular.
There were lots of resource rents to spread around.
Exactly. So when Chavez dies, Maduro comes into power, oil prices also start falling. Then you have a different situation where the government can no longer satisfy both the electorate and the military's electorate, and it has to choose. And that is the moment where Venezuelan politics, where these high stakes of power really start playing a fundamental role, which is the moment in which first Maduro and then the opposition with the levers that it has, including the support of the United States during the first Trump administration, start saying, well, in order to win the political conflict, we have to target the economy. We have to weaponize the economy against our adversaries. And my thesis is that it's that weaponization of the Venezuelan economy that really explains why we have this magnitude of collapse.
Yeah, I mean, you described this. I actually just want to interject that uh, there is a chat you can put in your questions. Please do so. I'm asking Francisco questions, but you can do so as well. So please post your questions in the chat. We'll take some of them intermittently or at the end. And also want to mention here that you have this description, your description of the style of politics that comes in after, you know, first with the shale boom and then yeah, and then kind of taking off from there, you have a series of events that lead to what you call scorched earth politics as a result of this extreme centralization, these very high stakes. So, so can you just go a bit deeper into that? Because the economic consequences are immense,
Yeah.
as are the foreign policy consequences. So,
Well, scorched earth is a term that's used in military theory. It's used in the theory of war. The concept in and of itself is often attributed to Karl von Clausewitz, and it has to do with the idea that you can prevail in military combat by depriving your enemy of resources. So something that happened when I started looking at Venezuela is that I started seeing that that this logic was being used by political actors, even though the contest over power was not an armed conflict. But the idea that they were that the way in which you could prevail would be by using these resources in a way that could generate damage in the economy, and you were aware of that, but that would strengthen you politically, is something that got into the Venezuelan modality, into the Venezuelan politicians' modality of thinking, and became pervasive over these years. So I put two examples. One of them is Nicolas Maduro, 2013. Maduro had won an election. Some people question it, but he does appear to have won by a small margin. Right after Chavez died. Now Chavez was reelected for a third term with a relatively comfortable margin. Maduro was not, and his and largely the way that people correctly understood it is he won because Chavez asked people to vote for him from his deathbed. So now Chavez had already left an economy that was in problems in 2013. The oil price had not begun to fall. It was stable. However, Chavez had spent a lot of money, and the country had run a significant both budget and even balance of payments deficit, which was somewhat unusual at the time for Venezuela, given oil prices, in order for Chavez to get reelected. So when Maduro comes into power, he has to put on the brakes, and that means that the economy, starts slipping into recession, and that's a moment in which the Maduro's popularity starts declining, and then there's a municipal election at the end of 2013, and the opposition decides that it's going to make that election central and that it's going to frame that election as a referendum on Maduro. So a municipal election would not maybe sound that relevant, but given that this was the first election that was truly Maduro's, with Maduro in power, with his record being on the line and being at the center of political discussion, it was very important for him. So so Maduro does the following. Exactly 1 month before the elections, he goes on national TV and using a Venezuelan law that essentially forces all carriers to carry his speeches, and he accuses the country's largest economics retailer, DACA, of price gouging. So this is like the Venezuelan Best Buy. And he claims that DACA was getting subsidized dollars under Venezuela's exchange control system in
Mhm.
order to import electronics and appliances, and that it was, however, selling them at a black market rate. And what that means is that effectively it was pocketing a 90% difference, and it was not passing the subsidy off on consumers. So now, was this accusation real or not? I mean, I go into that in the book, as with a lot in Venezuela, there's part of it was real and part of it was exaggeration. But the byproduct of that was that when people heard their president saying this, they went out and looted the store. And then Maduro brought in the military, but he brought in the military essentially to organize the looting. So he forced DACA to slash their prices to basically what ended up being about 10% of market prices. And people got their highly discounted electronics as long as they lasted. Now, this episode would actually end up marking the start of the Venezuelan scarcity crisis because retailers after that didn't want to import goods because they didn't know whether the president was going to expropriate them on his national news program. However, it was immensely popular and led Maduro to rise by 20 points in the polls and to effectively have his party win that municipal election by a landslide. So it's the weaponization of the economy. Maduro then did it with many social programs. The Going from the universalistic system that Chavez had created, which was very expensive and needed to, and he didn't have money to pay for it. So he went to a targeted system, but it was a politically targeted system where there was significant political conditioning to receive the transfers from the government. So that now. My central argument is that it's not just the government that does it. There's a moment at which the opposition starts thinking the same way, and depending on the setting, on the economy, on the political setting, oppositions don't necessarily always have the ability to impact the economy. But this one did for two
It's
reasons. One of them is that it was able to win a very large majority, in fact, initially a two-thirds majority in the Venezuelan National Assembly. And the second one, and that allowed it to do things like, for example, block issuance of debt and refinancing of debt. But most importantly, in 2017, the Trump administration comes into power in the US, and their Latin America policy is essentially run by very hawkish characters, and they ask the opposition, the hardline opposition, well, how can we support you? And they put on the table the idea of economic sanctions. So then,
and
then the opposition effectively gets this kind of economic weapon of mass destruction also with which it can target the economy, and it decides to do that. So you end up having both sides targeting the economy in their struggle over power.
yeah, I mean that's I think question that's coming from Ryan. So, and the 2015 election, just the fact that they are able to win that majority suggests that the electoral process was, you know, w was fair at least in that instance. There were other institutional issues that come up, but Ryan asks, to what extent did interference from external actors tip the scale? Curious to the extent to which foreign actors helped or hindered. And I think this gets to, because you have the 2015 election, you have the 2017 change in government over here, and then I think the maximum sanctions go into effect. They decide, if I'm not mistaken, they decide to boycott the next set of elections, and you have the sanctions come in at the same time. And all of this
Well,
is part of a process of interaction between Washington and the
yeah.
opposition. Is that correct?
Well, it's yes, but I mean, there are several elections and several decisions to boycott, and also several sanctions decisions. And one very important initial decision, which was the first set of economic sanctions, were the financial sanctions of August 2017. So Those were before the presidential elections that were boycotted in 2018, but they were after Maduro called elections for a constituent assembly, which was boycotted by the opposition. And that constituent assembly, part of what it did and was designed to do was to take away the powers of the legislative branch, which the opposition had
Hmm.
been
Yeah.
able to gain control of in the 2015 elections. Those financial sanctions were particularly important, and you can see. I mean, uh, I present a summary of the evidence in the book, but you can clearly see, for example, in the graph of Venezuelan oil production, how there are several inflection points at the moments at which sanctions are imposed or tightened. And the first inflection point, you find it in August 2017 with the financial sanctions. Another one in January 2019 with the oil sanctions, which are the ones that typically people refer to as being the maximum pressure sanctions. And then another one around February of 2020, which comes with the US decision to impose secondary sanctions on foreign oil partners who were helping sell Venezuelan oil outside of US markets. And that also had a visible effect. Interestingly, you also see in the data that when the US decides to grant the license to Chevron, then you have the opposite effect. Then you see another inflection point in which oil production starts recovering. So effectively, what you and again, I mean, I discuss a lot of the evidence also kind of using data, for example, the from joint ventures in the Orinoco Oil
Mhm.
Basin, in which I do think give us pretty compelling evidence that these initial 2017 financial sanctions had a significant effect. And part of the reason that they had a significant effect is that at that moment, 2017, where the Venezuelan economy was in big problems. The Venezuelan economy, first of all, oil prices had tanked from $100 a barrel to $30 a barrel in 2016. So the beginning of the crisis in Venezuela was not really driven by political factors. It was more of this traditional unraveling of the macroeconomics of populism, in which you had a government that had been completely overextended. It hadn't saved from the boom. It had overborrowed, and then oil prices go down, and it has no way to avoid doing a very large macroeconomic adjustment, which it had to do. So that's what you had up until 2016. Now, end of 2016, beginning of 2017, oil prices start recovering. And in fact, Venezuelan debt starts performing somewhat better. Kind of CDS spreads start going down. The credit default swap spreads, which are essentially capture the cost of insuring
Percent
against
default.
the
Yeah.
country's default starts going down. But that's where you get this change of strategy from the US with the Trump administration that comes in January of 2017 and starts imposing sanctions first on the Venezuelan government in a very aggressive way because Obama had imposed sanctions just on a few Venezuelan officials, and then it imposes these financial sanctions. And part of what happened there is that there were many firms, oil firms like Chevron, that had actually entered into lending agreements with the Venezuelan government so that Chevron would lend money to Venezuelan-controlled oil companies in which Chevron had a minority stake and would be paid out of the proceeds of the production of those companies. And those were the firms that were really hurt by the financial sanctions, but because they couldn't enter into that type of agreements anymore. So, I mean, to summarize actually and address this question by Ryan, the I do present some estimates in my book of what percentage of Venezuela's decline can be attributed to sanctions and other measures of economic statecraft, but which are essentially a manifestation of the U.S. foreign policy to try to isolate the Venezuelan economy. And my estimate is that around half, more precisely 52% of the contraction, can be attributed to these measures. So basically, what I'm arguing is that, look, if Venezuela hadn't fallen into this political crisis, which brought with it together this weaponization of the economy, including the use of sanctions to try to sever the country's access from trade and from international trade and finance, we would have seen a contraction of 35% of GDP. We would have seen a large economic crisis, a crisis such as the crises that are typically associated with the unraveling of populist macroeconomic experiments. But we saw something much, much larger than that. And we saw that because the political battle centered on the control of the country's access to international resources, to international funds. And that meant ultimately blocking the country off from access to finance and from access to export markets.
Thank you. There's a question from Lee here, who's at RS. But before we get to that, um, you know, um, I'd like to zoom out a little bit because this brings kind of a broader regional focus as well, I think, on two levels. One is just the classic book about the macroeconomics of populism is largely about South America, in fact, Dornbusch and Edwards, for instance. So, and it does seem as though what we see and have seen for some time is a pattern of populist left-right alternation that has been quite pronounced not just in Venezuela, but you look at Ecuador, you look at Bolivia, you look at Peru, across the Andean region, and the question is one question is to what extent you have a particular development strategy uh, based on integration with the global economy, primarily through commodity exports and exposure to international capital markets through dollar-based lending. That seems to be something that has been present in the region for some time, got it into trouble repeatedly, starting the Volcker shock in the 1980s, um, not before. The second point is the extent to which that pattern of ideological polarization within single countries in South America is mirrored or picked up on in DC. And the recent example here would be Bolsonaro's son claiming he asked for the 50% tariffs on Brazil, which seems to be a recent variant of this scorched earth policy, the weaponization of international economic relations by appealing to the extremely powerful neighbor to the north. So I was wondering if you could zoom out a little bit into this larger question about how Venezuela might reflect something that's happening um, for some time, in South America more broadly, and also where you see it going within uh, right now, given the
No,
ideological polarization both in DC and in large parts of
no.
South America.
Well, I think that the answer is yes. It reflects something that's happening in Latin America more broadly, including in the U.S., which is very rapidly imitating Latin American style politics. In fact, arguably becoming part of Latin America in many senses. So, I mean, first, there's um, this type of divide. Venezuela was the country where the pink tide started. I mean, it was where you see, the left, and much more so the radical left had not been electorally successful in Latin America. And when it had been electorally successful in some cases, such as that of Allende in Chile, it had not been it had not been able to govern. It had not been allowed to govern. The so but Chavez was able to do it. He was able to win elections, and he was able to put forward a political model in which he was able to hold on to power. And then you start seeing other people around the region imitating other leaders of the same ideological bent, imitating that approach. You see it in Rafael Correa, you see it in Evo Morales. You see it in Daniel Ortega when he gets his kind of second bite at the apple and he comes back. to power. And you also start seeing the emergence of these more moderate leftist governments, such as that of Lula in Brazil. And but you also see that there are two things that are happening at the same time. One of them is the emergence of the left, but another one is kind of the success of this what's sometimes called populist, but I prefer to refer to it as a personalistic style of governing, which is something that is not a monopoly of the left. I mean, you do see it in the Chavez, Correa, Morales, and you also see it in Uribe and in Bukele, for example, just
Hmm.
to name some recent examples in Fujimori at his time. So basically, the idea that what you need is concentration of power in order to address the problems of these countries. And I think that kind of both of these, Latin America is relatively fertile ground for these because it is inherently a very polarized society. It's a set of very unequal societies. The and I think, of course, you can ask, well, why hadn't it happened in Latin America before? And I do think that here there are a set of interactions, not only with the mode of economic insertion, but also with how political communication has changed over the course of the past few decades, and with the fact that traditional monopolies of media, of newspapers, no longer really exist. And that means that the space is much more wide open, much more kind of vulnerable to attempts by seizure by some of these kind of French groups, which can end up being politically very successful. And then that brings us to the United States. And when I said that the U.S. Was fastly becoming part of Latin America, it's because I think that the U.S. economic structure and political structure and its political modes of engagement look very much like the ones that we were used to seeing in Latin America. And I would trace that partly and perhaps primarily to the fact that the US has also, over the course of the past few decades, developed Latin American levels of inequality. So the US now has the Gini coefficient of Peru. It's not surprising to see that this level of economic polarization is going to lead to significant levels of discontent among the groups that rightly feel that they're not sharing in the progress of the country. And that is going to generate a demand for this populist, personalistic style of governance that promises that by concentrating power, it's going to be able to address these problems. I'm not saying that they're effective at doing it. I definitely don't believe that they are. But I do think that it comes with the territory of having these very unequal societies, which is something that the U.S. Let happen to its economy over the course of the past few decades. But then we get to this kind of other phenomenon, which is that uh, these these politics become international, and that's why I have a chapter of my book that's called "Politicians Without Borders," which effectively tries to capture this idea that really politics is being played not just on the national stage, and it kind of cuts both ways. I mean, first of all, you have the appeal of the hardliners on the opposition, be it the Venezuelan or the Bolsonaro opposition in Brazil, to the U.S. government, which has this remarkable economic power through the ability to impose sanctions, tariffs, through the ability to deprive particular actors or states of access to the U.S. financial system. That gives it a huge leverage. And then the U.S. can become an actor in domestic politics, but these elites also become a very important actor in U.S. domestic politics because part of what's driving this is the relevance of Latin American diaspora groups in terms of influencing foreign policy in the U.S. because they have political force, particularly in pivotal states. Now, there's very interesting research by Tyler Costren an article which I think is brilliant that demonstrates that the US is much more likely to impose sanctions on a country the larger that the diaspora of that country is in US swing states, which illustrates these dynamics that we see very clearly in the state of Florida. A lot of what we're seeing right now is catering to that very important group that's key for this pivotal state. And I wanted to kind of briefly the also address the point about kind of migration that Lee
Yeah.
Schlenker puts in his question. The I mean, I think it's very clear, and I think that the evidence is quite compelling. Venezuela was a low immigration country, and uh, it saw this huge exodus basically between 2014 and today, and primarily between 2014 and 2020, just as the economy kind of entered into free fall, just as wages were collapsing in the country, and this is clearly, and there's kind of also significant amount of evidence, for example, from opinion surveys, and if people leave because they can't make a living in Venezuela. They leave because wages have collapsed. They leave because their best economic decision is to go to another country and start sending money back home, and they can send much more resources to their family members by transferring a portion of the wages that they earn outside of the country than they would if they had stayed in Venezuela and transferred their full wage or their full earnings to the household. To the extent that there's also convincing evidence, and that's what I've laid out in my book and in a set of peer-reviewed publications, that sanctions have contributed significantly to Venezuela's economic collapse, then kind of the math is clear. I mean, it doesn't mean that sanctions are the only driver of Venezuelan immigration. As I said, the country would have had a huge economic crisis in the absence of sanctions, but the crisis has been much, much deeper because of sanctions, and that has been and the magnitude of this crisis has been a fundamental driver of the collapse. Lee also mentioned research published by Ricardo Hausman and Danny Bahar a few months ago, which tried to put forward the opposite thesis. Actually, they claimed that it was the other way around, that if Maduro had more resources, then that would lead people to leave because they would lose hope. And they presented some econometric exercises, some econometric estimates using the entry of Venezuelans into the U.S. borders, like irregular border crossings and border apprehensions, actually. And they argued that these correlated positively with Venezuelan oil revenues, that more oil revenues would lead more people to cross the border. Giancarlo Bravo, David Rosting, and I wrote a response to that a few months ago. First of all, and we pointed out there was a coding error in the analysis of Bahar and Hausman, and this is something that Bahar and Hausman have recognized now, and that basically makes that all of their statistically significant results disappear. So there's really no statistical effect of Venezuelan oil prices on border crossings of Venezuelans into the U.S. They still argue, well, you don't have a negative effect, which is what you would expect if sanctions were causing migration. And the reason for that, as my co-authors and I have explained, is twofold, but like, the primary one is it's just that this data is data that captures Venezuelans crossing into the U.S., not Venezuelans leaving Venezuela. And the
Mm.
majority of Venezuelans who try to cross into the U.S. have already left Venezuela several years ago. So we wouldn't expect it to be correlated in any way with oil prices. Actually, if there's any effect, it comes from what in economics we call admitted variable bias, which is that oil prices are correlated with economic conditions in the US. So when the US economy is doing well, US labor markets are tight, there's a lot of job opportunities and wages are growing, are also moments of high oil prices. And that explains any residual correlation. But well,
Um,
in any case, I mean, there's you can read both the paper of Danny and Ricardo and our response. But in my view, that issue is pretty much settled.
Francisco,
And
if I may just,
yep,
we're getting close. We're getting close to the end. I just want to zoom out once
sure.
again. You recently had not been in the FT where you talk about just the broader enormous human cost of sanctions policy with with your co-authors, one that appeared in the Lancet. I think you put it at more than 500,000 lives a year, and that's so at QI we're interested in the sanctions question more broadly as a facet of restraint. So wondering if you could address that, and also just in view of all this, just what, if any, recommendations you might have for the U.S. government in terms of how it should proceed from here uh, in its Venezuela policy as we close out.
Yeah, yeah. Um, yes. Well, the answer, I mean, the evidence on the effect of sanctions on living conditions in targeted countries, um, I think is pretty clear and it's pretty compelling. And we published a recent study where we looked at my co-authors and I, Sylvia Rendon, Mark Weisbord, and I had looked at the evidence on the effect of sanctions on mortality and effectively estimate that sanctions lead to increases in age-specific mortality rates, which lead from increases of up to 8% in the mortality rates of children under 5 to around 2% in the mortality of older age persons. The we quantify the effect of those sanctions using those estimates to an estimate of around 500,000 deaths a year, which is comparable to the death tolls associated with wars. And this is consistent. Again, we're not the first persons to find this. I mean, we what we did is that we used a set of quasi-experimental methods that, in our view, make the argument for causality, the argument that this is a causal effect and not just a correlation, very strong. But there's definitely quite a lot of research that has looked at not just at mortality, but also other health conditions, and that have looked also at economic conditions, the collapses in GDP, the deteriorations in public infrastructure, deteriorations in human rights conditions, and found that sanctions are by and large negatively associated with all of these. So sanctions are bad for people in the countries that suffer them, and the countries targeted by them. And then that leads to a very basic policy question, which is, why is it that that we're using this instrument that targets civilians in these countries? Now, there was a lot of preoccupation actually with this issue back in the 1990s after the evidence on the effects of Iraq sanctions on child mortality in that country, and there were a lot of attempts to reform the sanctions regime into a regime of more targeted, quote unquote, smart sanctions. But by and large, the evidence is that that hasn't happened. The countries imposing them might claim that these are targeted sanctions, but these sanctions really do affect the economies of these countries pretty strongly
You
through
get
several effects. I
overcompliance
mean,
is something that you pointed
well,
out.
partly it's overcompliance, but partly it's because they're designed that way. I mean, there's no oil. Technically, there's no oil embargo in Venezuela, on Venezuela. No U.S. oil embargo in Venezuela. There's just the decision by OFAC to designate one entity that is involved in the Venezuelan oil trade. That entity just happens to be PDVSA, which has a state monopoly, which is actually mandated constitutionally in Venezuela over the oil trade. So you can say this is a smart sanction because I just happen to target one firm, but the reality is that it's when you sanction the state-owned oil company, when you sanction a country's central bank, when you sanction a large part of its state apparatus, you're imposing sanctions on the country in itself. But the overcompliance, or what other people call kind of the chilling effect, this fact that that once there are sanctions on a country or on a country's government, private sector actors such as banks will stop doing business with that country because of the regulatory and reputational costs of the risk of being associated with a sanctioned entity. That also plays a very important role. So, then what should the U.S. do? Should it not impose sanctions? Well, I think that that's a question actually that we should be asking ourselves. I mean, if we're right and we believe that we are, and these sanctions are killing civilians, then this is no different from saying, oh, we just need to like throw a nuclear bomb on Moscow in order to pressure Putin, or on Tehran, or on Caracas for that matter. There's a good reason why doing that would be considered a war crime, and would be illegal according to current international law. Why don't we think the same way about the imposition of sanctions that target the livelihoods of the people who live in them? Now, of course, sometimes this discussion, when it comes to this, then people will ask, well, but what can we do? I mean, we must have, and it's interesting that this significant increase in the use of sanctions has really come alongside at least a decline uh, in the appetite of public opinion in the U.S. and European countries for explicit military intervention.
Yeah.
So that the idea of saying, well, let's get involved militarily in these conflicts doesn't play well. So sanctions are like the only thing sometimes that leaders feel that they can do. But I also think that um, you know, th- I mean, personally, there are some cases in which I think that sanctions should exist. I mean, I think that I wouldn't argue that there shouldn't have been sanctions on bin Laden or Al Qaeda. I mean, I can't imagine a world in which the U.S. would have decided not to use that instrument. But I also think that we just have to have like a more realistic way of thinking about how is it that we can positively influence what we want to change in the conduct of certain countries and states. Now, the reality is that using sanctions to promote democracy isn't something that makes all that much sense because the majority of the world's population lives in non-democratic countries, and you're not going to go around sanctioning every single country that does not have a perfect liberal democracy. And by the way, if you did that, then there might end up being a strong justification to sanction the U.S. among other countries. So the reality. There's a lot of careful work on what democracy promotion really entails and how do you foster democracy. And rarely does it come about by saying to an authoritarian regime, we're going to make life impossible for you and your people until you decide to turn democratic. There's a lot of work which will grab less headlines, but which will end up being much more effective. So, and to kind of close with or at least this question with a reference to one of the previous questions in Venezuela. Sometimes people are struck by the fact that the opposition was able to win and take control of the National Assembly in 2015. But actually, equally striking it is that Edmundo Gonzalez was able to document his victory in the 2024 elections. Why can we see that? Why did we see that in countries that are, that where authorities, well, where you have authoritarian governments and which can do like Maduro did last year, essentially outright steal an election. I think that the effort that was put through international cooperation with very strong involvement of the Carter Center through many decades in strengthening Venezuelan electoral institutions implied that Venezuela ended up having a really stellar electoral system in terms of electronic vote counting. And that now, I'm not, that didn't completely change the picture. Venezuela is an authoritarian government right now, but it did much more strengthen the hands of forces that wanted to push for real democratic accountability because you could look at the votes and you could count the votes in ways in which you can't in many other countries. And I'm bringing this up because I think that the work that was done, for example, by the Carter Center in helping strengthen Venezuelan electoral institutions at a time at which there were factions of U.S. foreign policy, of the U.S. foreign policy establishment that were criticizing the Carter Center for being involved in helping Venezuelan electoral institutions, actually did a lot more to support Venezuelan democratic forces than the maximum pressure approach of the
Okay.
Washington Hawks.
I'm afraid we're going to have to stop here, Francisco. This has been absolutely fascinating. We've run a bit over, but we could go on. I've really enjoyed this. Um, Absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. And if you're watching and you found this interesting and useful, please look at our website. We do lots of these kinds of things, lots of webinars, lots of written content. Just check out our stuff if you haven't already, um, and sign up. Thank you once again to the audience, and thank you so much, Francisco, for being here and for your book.
Thank you very much, Kartik. It's been a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed it.